The United States government spent years telling the public one story about Vietnam. Classified documents showed they knew a completely different one, and for years, no one outside the government could prove it. Until one man decided that was no longer acceptable. What he released didn't just expose a war. It exposed something about how power works that the government has never fully answered for. Here's what they didn't tell you about the Pentagon Papers. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara commissioned a classified study. He wanted to know the full history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, unfiltered and internal. What came back was 7,000 pages covering decisions made across 4 administrations: Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. It took 2 years to compile. It was marked top secret. And what it contained was, in the government's own words, the truth about the war it had been fighting. The problem was that truth looked nothing like what the public had been told. Pause for a second. U.S. involvement in Vietnam was being systematically expanded, while officials publicly minimized it. Private assessments had already concluded the war was unwinnable as early as the mid-1960s, while public statements remained confident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, used to justify dramatic military escalation, was misrepresented to Congress and the American people, and the decisions being made in private directly contradicted everything being said in press conferences, televised addresses, and congressional testimony. 4 presidents, 4 administrations, 1 continuous lie. And this is where it gets important. This was not one administration making one bad call. This was a continuous documented pattern. Officials knew, at the time they made their public statements, that those statements did not reflect their own internal assessments. The deception did not begin and end with any single president. It was inherited, continued, and expanded. Each administration received the real picture, updated it, and told the public a different version. If multiple administrations knew the truth, why did none of them stop it? That question does not have a clean answer. The closest the record comes is this. Each administration feared that admitting the truth would mean admitting the failure of its predecessor, and by extension, the entire framework of Cold War policy that had justified the war. So the deception continued, not because one person lied once, but because the system made the truth too expensive to admit. And then came Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg was a military analyst who had worked at Rand Corporation and the Department of Defense. He had the clearances, he had helped compile the study, he had read every page, and between 1969 and 1971, he made a decision. He photocopied all 7,000 pages and offered them to the New York Times. Now think about that. One person, with access. Who decided the public had a right to know? In June 1971, the Times began publishing excerpts. The Nixon administration went to federal court and obtained a temporary restraining order, the first prior restraint on a major American newspaper in U.S. history, blocking further publication on the grounds of national security. But here's where it shifts, because the government's national security argument had a serious problem. Most of what was in the papers was historical. The events described had already happened. The military operations already concluded. What the papers revealed was not an active strategy that could be compromised. What they revealed was a track record of decisions made, while officials told the public something else. What was more dangerous, the information itself, or the public finally seeing it? And this is where the government lost control of the story. The legal battle reached the Supreme Court in 9 days. On June 30th, 1971, the court ruled 6-3 in favor of the New York Times and the Washington Post. The government had not met the heavy burden required to justify prior restraint. But that wasn't the end of it. The papers were published, and then something happened that the history books treat as a footnote, but deserves more attention. And this is where the story stops being informative and starts becoming uncomfortable. The war continued. 4 years after the Pentagon Papers were published, Vietnam finally ended in 1975. During those 4 years, tens of thousands more Americans died, thousands more Vietnamese died. The bombing of Cambodia expanded. The war that the government's own classified documents had privately described as unwinnable continued through public exposure, a Supreme Court ruling, and one of the most significant press freedom victories in American history. The truth came out, and the machine kept going. If the truth comes out and nothing changes, what does that actually mean? It means the Pentagon Papers were not the end of the story. They were a window into something larger, and what they revealed when you look at the full arc rather than just the legal drama is a picture of how systems of power actually respond to accountability. Now fast forward to what that looks like. The Nixon administration did not stop at the courts. It created a covert unit known as the Plumbers, specifically tasked with stopping leaks. One of their first operations was breaking into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, looking for information to discredit him. Members of that same unit later became the Watergate burglars. The attempt to suppress the Pentagon Papers did not just fail in court, it directly contributed to the chain of events that brought down a presidency. And this is the part most people miss. Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act. He faced 115 years in prison, and in 1973 all charges were dismissed, not because he was found innocent, but because of government misconduct, the break-in at his psychiatrist's office, illegal wiretapping, direct interference with the trial itself. The government's response to the truth being released was so legally compromised that it could not prosecute the man who released it. And that is where the story lands. The Pentagon Papers are remembered as a press freedom victory, a moment when the courts protected journalism, when a whistleblower exposed government deception and the system held. And in one narrow sense, that is true. But here's the reframe. The documents covered more than 20 years of decisions. They were commissioned by a Secretary of Defense who had himself helped make many of those decisions. They were marked top secret, not because their contents would compromise active operations, but because their contents would compromise the people who made the decisions they described. They were leaked by a man who spent years inside the system before concluding the public deserved to know what that system had done. And they were suppressed by an administration that had not even been in power for most of the events they described, because the pattern they revealed was institutional, not personal. This was never just about Vietnam. It was about the gap between what governments know and what they choose to say, about what happens when that gap is exposed and the system absorbs the exposure without fundamentally changing, about the distance between truth arriving and truth mattering. Because maybe the most disturbing part is not that the public was lied to, maybe it is that the truth eventually came out and the system survived it. Because at that point, it is not just history anymore, it is a pattern. So here's the question worth sitting with. If classified documents exposing years of deception could be published, debated in the Supreme Court, and seen by the entire country, and nothing actually stopped, what does that tell you? And more importantly, if the truth only comes out after the decisions are made, the damage is done, and the people responsible are already gone, was it ever really meant for the public at all? Tell me in the comments what you think, because the Pentagon Papers answered a lot of questions, and quietly opened ones that have never been closed.